The War Council smelled like ozone and political cowardice. 9 species sat around the curved table aboard the Citadel Station Pale Reach, and every single one of them was losing. The holographic map at the center of the room told the story in red. 3 border systems gone in 60 days, swallowed by the breath dominion like a snake, unhinging its jaw around something still breathing. The Realoid delegate spoke in measured tones about strategic repositioning. The Torvani delegate used the phrase calculated withdrawal. Nobody said the word retreat because nobody in the room had the spine for honesty. Commander Cole Briggs watched the whole thing from the observation gallery. Above, arms folded, jaw set, saying nothing. He had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of a longer silence. 42 years old, career Navy. He spoke the way some men breathe, only when absolutely necessary. His exo. Danny Voss leaned over. They've been talking for 4 hours. I noticed. You think they'll ask us? Cole didn't answer. He already knew. Down on the council floor, Earth's ambassador rose from her seat. Mag Dunn was 56, built like a librarian who had survived a bar fight, and she carried herself with the kind of patience that only looked polite until you realized it was a loaded weapon. She waited for the room to quiet. It took a while. Nobody rushed to hear what the humans had to say. Earth formally offers a combined expeditionary force, she said. 4,000 ground troops, a carrier group, Special Operations Detachment. We are ready to deploy within 72 hours. Silence. Not the respectful kind, the kind you get at a dinner table when a child says something embarrassing and the adults are deciding whether to laugh or ignore it. The Torvani delegate, a broad-shouldered creature with skin like hammered bronze, tilted his head. Ambassador Dunn, your species has held a provisional seat on this council for 3 centuries. You have never fought in an interstellar conflict. You have no operational experience against a hive collective. With respect, this is not the moment for ambition. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Someone from the Plessy delegation said something in their own language that the translation matrix rendered as sending house pets into a firestorm. Mag smiled, the kind of smile that lived only on the mouth and left the eyes cold as deep water. She didn't argue. She placed the deployment order on the table, gave a small nod, and sat down. Cole watched from above. Danny leaned over again. She's good. She's from Boston, Cole said. Like that explained everything. It did. 3 days later, the carrier Blackjack run dropped out of faster than light travel at the edge of Concord controlled space and announced itself with all the subtlety of a drop toolbox. The ship was functional, angular, and ugly in the way that only human engineering could manage, built to survive, not to impress. The Riello escort vessels flanking it looked like swans babysitting a cement truck. Concord liaison officer Varric's son Ty came aboard within the hour. He was Riefi, tall, angular, with skin the color of pale silver and eyes that processed everything like a camera shutter. He had been assigned to observe the human contingent, report on their capabilities, and if Cole was reading between the lines correctly, document their inevitable failure so the Concord could say they gave the humans a fair chance. Varric walked through the ship like a health inspector touring a restaurant he already planned to shut down. The corridors were too narrow, the lighting was too harsh, the soldiers were too loud. A group of them were clustered around a screen in the mess hall, watching something they called a hype reel, which appeared to be footage of combat set to music with a heavy bass line. One soldier was doing push-ups in the hallway for no reason Very could identify. He passed the armory. A woman with sergeant stripes was cleaning her rifle and singing under her breath. Young man next to her was talking non-stop about the structural integrity of field bridges while she ignored him completely. Varric made notes. He found Cole on the bridge standing in front of a tactical display that showed the breath advance. In real time, Cole didn't turn around. Liaison Officer Sun Tai Cole said, "Welcome aboard, Commander Briggs. I've completed my initial assessment of your vessel and personnel." And Varric paused. Diplomacy was a wreathy art form, but honesty was faster. Your troops are emotionally undisciplined. Your pre-combat rituals appear to involve recreational aggression. Your ship is functional. Functional, Cole repeated like he was tasting the word. That's generous. Varric submitted his first report to Concord High Command that evening. It was thorough, clinical, and exactly what the council expected to hear. The final line read, emotionally undisciplined, tactically untested, recommend observation role only. Cole read a copy of the report an hour after it was filed. Human intelligence was not subtle, but it was fast. He set the data pad down, looked at Danny and said, "Good, let them think that." Danny grinned. "You love being underestimated." "I love winning. The underestimation is just a head start." 2 days later, the breath broke through the Concord defensive line at the Soma Relay. 2 days ahead of every projection. 2 days before the nearest Elder fleet could reposition. The breath poured through the gap like water through a cracked dam, and on the other side was Soma 3, an agricultural world, 60 million civilians, no meaningful military presence. Varric brought the news to Cole personally. He expected urgency, panic maybe. He had prepared a list of recommended Concord protocols, estimated response timelines, and a careful explanation of why the humans should remain in a support capacity until the Elder fleets arrived. Cole checked his watch, not a dramatic gesture, not a performance. He checked it the way a man checks the time before leaving for work. "How long till?" he asked. Ver told him. Cole nodded once, a single dip of the chin like a period at the end of a sentence. "Wake everybody up." The Blackjack run changed heading. Within the hour, 4,000 humans moved toward the Soma Relay while 9 Elder species were still arguing about the seating chart. The Rex stood on the bridge and watched the stars shift in the viewport and tried to name the feeling settling into his chest. He couldn't. It was unfamiliar. It was something like dread, but turned sideways. He filed it away and told himself it was indigestion. It was not indigestion. The drop pods hit the atmosphere of Soma 3 like a handful of burning coins thrown at the ground. Concord Protocol said ground deployment required a 48-hour staging period, orbital mapping, supply chain confirmation, risk modeling, 3 rounds of approval from species-specific command structures. The humans skipped all of it. 4 hours after the Blackjack run arrived in system, boots were on dirt, equipment half-loaded, battle plans drawn on the drop itself, sketched on data pads while the pods shook and rattled and the air tasted like hot metal and recycled fear. Sergeant Lucy Tran landed in the Northern Agricultural Belt with her platoon tucked around her. Like a fist, 29 years old, third generation military, she had her mother's jaw, her father's bad knees, and a sense of humor so dark it could absorb light. She hit the ground, rolled, checked her weapon, checked her people, and said, "All right, somebody. Tell me where the bugs are so I can ruin their day." Corporal Eli Marsh landed 6 meters to her left, tangled in his own harness, already talking. He was 24, a combat engineer, and he talked the way other people breathed, constantly, reflexively, and with no apparent awareness that he was doing it. The soil composition here is actually really interesting, Sarge. It's a silica calcium blend that would be great for foundations but terrible for trenching, which is going to be a problem because I'm pretty sure we're going to need trenches. Eli, yeah, shut up and dig. He dug. The breath hit them within the hour. Lucy had read the briefing files. Insectoid fast, coordinated through localized hive mind that let them move as a single organism across a battlefield. Every engagement report from conquered forces said the same thing. The breath moved like a flood. They didn't fight battles, they occupied space. One moment the ground ahead was empty, the next it was full of kitten and blade limbs and the sound of something between a scream and a frequency your bones heard before your ears did. First wave came through the grain field, tall stalks of something golden. An alien parted like curtains, and behind the curtains was nothing good. Lucy's platoon opened fire. The noise was enormous, not just the weapons. They breath themselves made sound when they moved. A clicking, hissing, buzzing chorus that got inside your skull and set up camp. Lucy fired, moved, fired. Again the training held. The fear was there. It was always there, tucked behind the ribs like a second heartbeat. But the training sat on top of it like a lid on a pot. Eli took a round through the shoulder. 14 minutes into the engagement, he went down sideways, hit the dirt with a sound like a bag of tools dropped from a table, and said, "Oh, that's not ideal." Lucy grabbed him by the vest and dragged him behind a grain silo. The silo was made of something smooth and gray, and it smelled like burned sugar. She tore open a field kit and started patching the wound while rounds sparked off the other side of their cover. "How's it look?" Eli asked, his face the color of old paper. "You've got a new hole." "Congratulations. Is it bad?" "You've had worse haircuts." He laughed, which hurt, which made him laugh again, which hurt more. Lucy tied off the bandage, slapped his good shoulder, and got back on the line. The breath adapted 20 minutes into the battle. This was the thing every conquered after action report described with something close to awe. The hive mind didn't just coordinate, it learned mid-fight in real time. Units that had been pressing the center pulled back and flowed around the flanks like water, finding the lowest ground. New corridors of attack opened. Firing lanes that had been safe 2 minutes ago became kill zones. Every conquered species that had faced this adaptation had broken. The Riello retreated in order. The Torvani held and took 70% casualties. The Plessy simply collapsed. The hive mind shift was the VTH's signature move, the thing that made them feel inevitable. Lucy watched it happen. She watched the left flank fold inward, watched the firing angles go wrong, watched the careful geometry of her platoon's position start to crack. And then something happened that the breath had never encountered. The humans adapted back, not cleanly, not elegantly. There was no grand signal, no tactical algorithm, no hive mind. There was Lucy screaming at her fire team leaders. There was a squad on the left, breaking formation and reforming around a drainage ditch they'd noticed on the way in. There was a machine gunner named Joe who picked up his weapon and sprinted to a new position because he could see the angle changing and didn't wait for anyone to tell him what to do. It was messy. It was loud. It was the exact opposite of the VH's elegant fluid motion. It worked. The breath formation stuttered, not a collapse, a hesitation like a river hitting a rock it didn't expect. The hive mind had a model for every conquered species' response to the adaptation. It did not have a model for a species that broke its own formation on purpose and rebuilt it from scratch in 90 seconds while screaming profanity. Up in orbit, Varric watched the battle data scroll across his screen. Blue markers for humans, red for breath. The blue markers were taking losses, more losses than any conquered commander would accept. He waited for the retreat order. It didn't come. Instead, Cole pushed reinforcements forward, fresh squads dropping into the hot zone, filling the gaps, thickening the line. Varric turned to Danny Voss, who was standing behind him with a cup of coffee and the calm expression of a man watching weather. Commander Briggs is sending more troops into a contested zone. Your casualty rate is already at 9%. Danny took a sip. Yep, the standard conquered threshold for tactical withdrawal is 6%. Good thing we're not the conquered. Why is he not pulling back? Danny looked at the screen. The blue markers were holding. Barely bleeding, but holding. Because they're dying, Danny said, which means they're close enough to win. Varric stared at him. The translator worked perfectly. The words made grammatical sense, and yet they sounded like a language he had never learned. On the ground, Lucy's platoon held the line through the night. When dawn came up over the grain fields of S3, the golden stalks were flattened and burned and mixed with things Lucy didn't look at too closely. Eli was propped against the silo with his arm in a sling, still talking. Sho was asleep, sitting up, his machine gun across his lap like a metal blanket. Lucy sat in the dirt and ate a ration bar that tasted like cardboard. Had given up on life. Her hands were steady. Her pulse was normal. She had been in the worst firefight of her life, and the only thought in her head was that she needed new boots because these ones had someone else's blood on them, and it was starting to smell. She keyed her comms tram to command. Northern belt is held. Breath have pulled back to secondary positions. We're still here. Pause, then Cole's voice, flat and dry as desert sand. Good work, Sergeant. Get some rest. Copy that. She didn't rest. None of them did, but it was nice of him to pretend they might. Varric's second report went out that evening. It was shorter than the first. He had deleted 3 drafts because they all sounded like things he wasn't ready to believe. The final version contained no recommendations, no tactical analysis, no cultural observations about noise levels or pre-combat music, just one line: they do not fight the way they should. Revising all projections, he stared at the sentence for a long time. Before sending it, it wasn't enough. It didn't capture what he'd seen. The screaming, the improvisation, the way they bled and kept going like bleeding was just another task on a list. He didn't have the words for it yet. He would find them later. By then the words would be too small for what they needed to hold. The news about S3 moved through the galaxy the way fire moves through dry grass, fast, uneven, and impossible to control. The humans had held, not with elegance, not with the precise geometric formations the Ryathi used, or the brute armor walls the Torvani favored. They'd held the way a man holds a door, shut against a storm with his shoulder, his weight, his teeth if he has to. The galactic information feeds didn't know what to make of it. 3 elder species had already written off Soma 3. The humans took it back with 4,000 soldiers, and what one conquered analyst described with visible confusion as aggressive improvisation. Lieutenant Kara Reeves didn't watch the feeds. She didn't care what the galaxy thought. She cared about what the breath were thinking, which was a much harder question because the breath didn't think the way individuals thought. They thought the way weather thinks, collectively, massively, and with no single point you could argue with. Kara was 34, naval intelligence. She had a face that gave away nothing and eyes that were always 2 conversations ahead of her mouth. She'd spent 3 weeks running signals analysis on the breath hive mind, and she'd found something buried in the data that the Concord's best analysts had missed, not because they were stupid, because they were thinking like individuals, and the breath were not individuals. She presented her findings to Cole in his office, which was a gray room with a desk, a chair, and absolutely no personal effects. The man decorated the way he talked at the bare minimum required for function. The hive mind isn't just a communication system, she said. She pulled up a waveform on her data pad, dense, layered, pulsing with rhythms that looked almost biological. Every breath soldier shares sensory input with the collective: sight, sound, touch. Cole looked at the waveform. Pain. Kara nodded. When a breath soldier dies, the entire local network feels it, not as data, as experience. They feel the death, every single one of them. Cole leaned back. The chair didn't cack because nothing on the ship was allowed to make unnecessary noise. That's why they've never lost before. Every species they fought, when the casualties hit a threshold, the enemy breaks. The breath just keep absorbing it because the collective distributes the cost. That's the standard reading, but I think the standard reading is wrong. Karara's mouth did the thing it always did before. She delivered bad news, a small, precise smile that meant she was about to rearrange someone's understanding of the situation. The distribution isn't free. It costs them. Every death is a wound to the whole system. They've just never fought a species that made the cost high enough to matter. She let that sit. Until us, Cole said. Until us. Every time we take a hit and don't stop, the hive mind has to process something it has no framework for. Species that absorbs casualties the way they do individually, painfully, without the luxury of distributing it, and keeps fighting. We don't share the pain. We carry it alone, and we keep going anyway. Cole was quiet for a long time. In the silence, you could hear the ship breathing, the low hum of systems keeping 4,000 humans alive in the emptiness between stars. What does that mean strategically? He asked. The smile again. It means our stubbornness is a weapon. Every soldier we lose, and every soldier who keeps fighting after the loss, the hive mind has to reconcile. that we break their model just by being what we are. Cole filed the information. The way he filed everything, quietly, completely, and with the intention of using it at the worst possible moment. For the enemy, 2 days later, Nate Harlow got his orders. Nate was 38, Spec Ops team lead, and built with the kind of dense, functional muscle that said he'd spent his life carrying heavy things over long distances, equipment wounded, soldiers, the weight of decisions that couldn't be taken back. He had a face that looked kindic, which were the eyes of a man who had already done the math on every room he walked into and knew where the exits were. His team was 6 people. The mission was the destruction of a breath relay node, a nexus point where the local hive mind concentrated its coordination signals for the entire Soma. 3. Take out the node and every breath unit on the planet would lose its connection to the collective for a window of time. How long depended on how fast the hive mind could reroute. Tara estimated 11 minutes. 11 minutes of an army operating without its brain. The Conquered would have sent 600 soldiers for this mission, a full battalion with armor support and orbital cover. Nate had 6 people and a bag of explosives that his demolition specialist, a woman named Kit Fallner, referred to as the good stuff, they inserted behind breath lines at night, dropped from a shuttle that never slowed down, hit the ground running, and disappeared into the dark terrain like water into sand. The relay node was buried in a canyon system 3 km behind the front line. The breath didn't guard it heavily because no conquered species had ever attempted a deep penetration strike this small. Their strategic models didn't account for it. 6 soldiers wasn't an assault force. 6 soldiers was a rounding error. Nate's team moved through breath occupied territory for 9 hours. They moved on foot. They moved quiet. When they couldn't move quiet, they moved fast. When they couldn't move fast, they stayed still and breath so slowly that their heart rates dropped to numbers that would concern a doctor. They reached the canyon at dawn. The relay node was a structure of dark organic material pulsing faintly like a heart. Made of architecture, it sat at the bottom of the canyon, surrounded by thin perimeter of wrath centuries. 12, maybe 15. 15 to 6, whispered Kit, lying on her stomach at the canyon rim. I like those odds. No, you don't, Nate said. No, I don't, but I like them better than going home and explaining why we didn't try. They went in fast and close. The vets' centuries were built for coordinated response. They fought beautifully when the hive mind could orchestrate them in a close quarters ambush with no warning and no time to coordinate. They died. Like anything else, Nate's team cleared the perimeter in 2 minutes, took 1 casualty, a graze across the ribs of a man named Sam Porto, who swore so creatively that Kit told him to write it down so she could use it later. Kit set the charges, 30 seconds of careful placement that looked careless to anyone who didn't understand that demolitions was an art form disguised as destruction. The relay node came apart in a column of white fire and the world changed. On the front line 3 km away, the breath stopped, not a retreat, not a tactical pause. They stopped the way a puppet stops when you cut the strings. For 11 minutes, the hive mind that coordinated every movement, every flanking maneuver, every elegant adaptation went silent. Lucy Tran didn't know why the breath had frozen. She didn't need to know. She keyed her comms, said 2 words, push. Now, and her platoon moved forward. In those 11 minutes, the human ground forces advanced more ground than they had in the previous 3 days combined. They moved through breath positions that had been unbreakable an hour ago. They moved through the gaps that appear when a species built on unity is forced to stand alone. When the hive mind reconnected, the breath found themselves in positions they no longer controlled, fighting an enemy that had rearranged the entire battlefield while they were blind. Up in orbit, Varric watched the tactical display and said nothing. Conquered Admiral beside him, old Torvani, veteran of 6 campaigns, watched the same data. His voice was very quiet when he finally spoke. How long have the humans been capable of this? His aide checked the records, cross-referenced the species file, pulled the cultural and military history that the conquered had archived when humanity was granted provisional membership 300 years ago. Their species has been fighting wars among themselves for approximately 10,000 years, sir. The room went still. 9 officers from 4 species stood in that stillness and felt it settle into them, the understanding that the species they'd been tolerating, humoring, condescending to for 3 centuries had been sharpening itself against its own bones since before any of their civilizations had achieved space flight. The Admiral closed the file. He didn't say anything else. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't say better. Varric's son Tai had spent his entire career studying species. He had written 11 published papers on interspecies behavioral dynamics, been cited by the Concord Academy of Xenological Studies 4 times, and once delivered a lecture to 600 Riello scholars on the subject of predictive modeling of lesser species combat response. That lecture now embarrassed him in a way he could feel physically, like a bruise under the skin. That oct when he moved wrong, he was no longer on the Blackjack Runs Bridge. He was on the ground. Call Kelly's Station. Orbital tethered city, 12 million civilians, the last defensive point before the Conquered's core worlds. The Vreth had launched a massive counteroffensive across 3 systems, and Kelly's was where the line either held or didn't. Cole had assigned the humans to the western sector, the side intelligence said would take the hardest hit. The Conquered's elder forces held the east. Varric had requested ground assignment. No one had asked him to. No one expected a Riello liaison officer to stand in the dirt. But something had changed in the weeks he'd spent aboard the human ship, eating their terrible food and listening to their strain music and watching them prepare for death the way other species prepared for dinner, with routine complaint and the occasional joke that made no logical sense but made everyone laugh. He wanted to see it from the inside, not the data, not the tactical feeds, the thing itself. He got his wish on the 3rd day of the battle. Pete Calloway was 26, a field medic and the kind of person who made Varric's behavioral models fall apart completely. He was not particularly large or fast or skilled in combat. He carried a medical kit that weighed almost as much as he did, and a sidearm he'd fired exactly twice in his career, both times at a ranged target, and both times badly. Inside his helmet, taped to the inner curve where it sat against his forehead, was a photograph of his dog, a fat golden retriever named Biscuit, who had, according to Pete, the soul of a philosopher and the body of a small couch. Pete was by every metric Varric knew how to measure a non-essential combat asset. Pete was also the reason Varric's third report would change the war. The breath hit the western sector at dawn. They came in numbers that turned the horizon dark, a moving wall of chitin and blade limbs stretching across the flat terrain surrounding Kelly's like a tide coming in across a beach. The sound arrived before they did, that bone-deep buzzing that the human soldiers had started calling the hum you didn't hear. The hum you felt it in your teeth. The human line held for 4 hours, then the breath punched through a section near the southern edge, and the line became a suggestion instead of a fact. Units scattered, communications broke down. The organized defense became something messier, pockets of soldiers fighting. Isolation, cut off from each other, cut off from command. Varric was with a squad in the central block when Pete Calloway ran past them toward the breach, toward the sound of the hum and the screaming, and the particular noise of wreath blade limb makes when it hits body armor. Calloway, someone shouted, wrong direction. Pete didn't stop. He disappeared into the dust and the noise, and Varric watched him go with the bewildered expression of a man watching someone walk calmly into a fire. Pete came back 4 minutes later dragging a wounded soldier by the vest. The soldier was conscious, bleeding from the leg, swearing in a continuous stream that had a certain poetry to it. Pete pulled him behind cover, patched the wound, squeezed his shoulder, and ran back out. He did it again. The second time the soldier he brought back was unconscious. Pete checked vitals, stabilized the bleeding, flagged the position for evacuation, and stood up. He did it a third time, the third time of breath. Round caught him in the leg. Not a clean hit, the kind that tears through the muscle and leaves everything else technically functional but screaming. Pete went down. He stayed down for 3 seconds, then he grabbed the wounded soldier he'd come for, looped the man's arm over his own shoulder, and dragged them both back to cover on one good leg. And what Varric could only describe as pure irrational refusal to stop. Varric watched all of this. He had stopped taking notes. His data pad hung at his side, forgotten. He was watching something that his entire education told him should not exist, a species that expended more energy protecting its wounded than it spent on offensive combat. A medic who ran into fire not because he was ordered to, not because it was strategically sound, but because someone was hurt and he could not physically make himself leave them there. It was inefficient. It was tactically insane. It was the most extraordinary thing Varric had ever seen. The western line broke at midday. For 40 minutes, the human defensive position did not exist as a line. It existed as fragments, fire teams, pairs, individual soldiers fighting alone in the rubble of a city that was coming apart around them. No communication, no coordination, no orders from command, because command couldn't reach them through the interference and the dust and the chaos. Every model Varric had ever studied said this was the end. A fragmented force without communication or command. Structure was a defeated force. The mathematics were settled. The outcome was determined. The humans had not read the mathematics. It started in small ways. A fire team on the left found a fire team in the center. They merged. Sniper on a rooftop started calling out breath positions to anyone who could hear, and 3 separate squads adjusted their movement based on her voice alone. A sergeant whose name Varric never Learn stood on top of a burn-it-out vehicle and started directing traffic, like he was managing an intersection, instead of a battle waving squads into position with hand signals that shouldn't have worked at that distance, but did because the humans were looking. For each other, they were always looking. For each other. The line reformed. Ragged, bloody, full of holes, but continuous. Varric stood in the middle of it and felt the ground shake from breath. Artillery and watched Pete Calloway, leg bandaged, limping, still moving, pull another wounded soldier to safety, and he understood something that he could not have understood from orbit, not from data, not from reports, only from standing in the dirt with them while the world fell apart. These humans did not fight as a military, they fought as a family. The bonds holding their line together were not tactical and not strategic and not rational, they were emotional. Every soldier on that line was fighting for the person beside them. Not the objective, not the city, not the 12 million civilians behind them. The person, the individual face and voice, and name next to them in the smoke, and because of that, because each of them was fighting for something small and close and personal, the sum of all those small fights was something enormous, something the breath hive mind for all its collective intelligence could not understand. The hive fought as one. Humans fought as many for each other, and the result was the same unity without any of the fragility. The VTH pulled back from Kelly's at sunset, first voluntary retreat in the history of the war. That night Varric sat in a corner of a destroyed building and wrote his third report by the light of a chemical flare. His hands were dirty, there was dust in his hair. He had fired a weapon for the first time in his life that afternoon, picking up a fallen Soldier's rifle and shooting at a breath that had breached their cover. He'd missed. Pete had patted him on the back and said, "Good effort, big guy." The report opened with a sentence he wrote without thinking and then could not bring himself to change. "I have been wrong about the humans in every way that matters." He described what he'd seen, a medic, the Reformation, the way they looked for each other in the chaos. He wrote about efficiency and how every species in the conquered worshipped it, and how the humans were the worst at it, and how that was the reason they won. Line that went viral across the Galactic feeds, the line that was translated into 400 languages and quoted in 17 parliaments and carved into the stone of memorials that hadn't been built yet was this: they are not reckless, they simply love each other more than they fear death. On the Blackjack Run, Colbriggs read the report for the first time in the entire war. He laughed, a real one. Short, quiet, but real. Danny looked over what? Cole shook his head. Riathi finally figured us out. Took him long enough, took all of them long enough. Cole looked at the viewport, where the stars hung cold and indifferent and impossibly far away. 300 years of provisional membership, 300 years of being the galaxy's joke, and all it took was one guy standing in the dirt with us to see what we actually are. Danny waited. Cole didn't finish the thought. He didn't need to. The stars said it for him that humans were small and brief and breakable, and none of that mattered even a little bit when they decided something was worth fighting for. 3 months after Kelly's, the galaxy looked different. Not the stars. The stars were the same cold points of light. They'd always been, indifferent to the politics of the species that live beneath them, but the maps had changed. The breath advance had stalled for the First time in the Dominion's history. Stopped not by a superior force, but by a force that refused to behave the way superior forces were supposed to behave. The front line stabilized, conquered. Fleets using human tactics, human stubbornness, and a new understanding of the breath hive mind's vulnerabilities had pushed back in 3 sectors. And then Admiral Tess Whitley arrived. The second fleet dropped out of faster than light travel at the edge of conquered space on a Tuesday morning, and every species with a sensor array pointed in that direction went very, very quiet. Tess Whitley was 50, sharp-featured with silver hair. She kept short and eyes that had seen enough to stop being surprised by anything except stupidity. She had commanded Earth's home defense fleet for 6 years, and during those 6 years she had been quietly, patiently, without fanfare or announcement, building something the galaxy did not know existed. The second fleet was not 4,000 troops and a carrier group. The second fleet was 40 warships, 18,000 ground forces, and an orbital weapons platform that the Concords technical analysts would spend the next decade trying to understand. The Ryathi delegation watched the fleet arrive. Nobody called it quaint. The Torvani admiral, who had asked how long humans had been capable of fighting, stood on his bridge and counted the ships as they appeared on his display, one after another, and when he reached 40, he sat down heavily and said a word in his own language that the translation matrix could not render. But that meant approximately, "We have been asleep." Cole Briggs met Tess on the Blackjack Run's hangar deck. She stepped off the shuttle, looked around at the ship that had started the whole thing, and said, "You look tired." "Commander, I am tired, Admiral." "Good. Tired people don't make stupid mistakes. They've already made them all." Her grip was dry and firm and carried the weight of a woman who had waited a very long time for this moment. "Show me the plan." The plan was this: a joint conquered human assault on the breath forward command nexus, not a relay node, the central nexus, the brain of the entire invasion corridor, a structure buried in the crust of a dead moon at the heart of breath-occupied space, protected by the largest concentration of ref forces in the war. Destroy it and the Dominion would lose coordination across 4 systems simultaneously. The hive mind would survive. It was too distributed to kill with a single strike, but it would be blind and deaf and screaming for long enough to break the invasion permanently. Cole led the ground assault. Lucy's platoon was on point. Nate's Spec Ops team would infiltrate ahead to breach the Nexus. Kara ran intelligence from orbit, feeding real-time data to every unit on the ground. Varric, who had been told 3 times that his role was observational and who had ignored this instruction 3 times, picked up a rifle and walked to the drop ship with the ground forces. Nobody questioned it. The soldiers around him nodded. One of them, Eli Marsh, shoulders still stiff, mouth still running, clapped him on the back and said, "Welcome to the family, big man." Varric did not know what to say to that, so he said nothing, which turned out to be the right answer. The battle for the dead moon had no name. Later historians would call it the Battle of the Threshold, but the soldiers who fought it called it nothing, because they were too busy fighting to name things. The Verith defended the Nexus with everything they had. The ground around the moon's surface was a killing field, open terrain, no cover. and Verith units so dense they looked like the ground itself was moving. The human and conquered forces landed under fire and stayed under fire and kept moving forward through fire because backward was not a direction. Colbriggs acknowledged. Lucy's platoon hit the surface and started pushing toward the Nexus entrance. Eli was beside her. Talking, always talking, the regallith here is actually really unstable, Sarge. It's a calciumite compound that fractures under sustained vibration, which means the artillery is going to. Eli, is that information going to keep me alive in the next 10 seconds? Probably not. Then save it. He saved it. For about 40 seconds, Nate's team went in ahead, 6 people moving through the tunnels beneath the moon's surface toward the Nexus core. The tunnels were breath organic dark, pulsing with the same faint rhythm as the relay node on Soma 3, but deeper, louder, like being inside something alive. Kit Fowler carried the charges. Sam Porto, ribs still tender from the graze on Soma 3, walked point. Nate walked behind him and said nothing and watched everything. They reached the core. It was enormous, a chamber the size of a cathedral, and at its center a structure of dark, organic matter that pulsed with light. Not electric light, not bioluminescence, but something older, something that looked like thought made visible. The Nexus, the brain. Kit looked at it. That's the ugliest thing I've ever seen. Set the charges, Nate said. She set them. The breath hive mind knew. Of course it knew. The Nexus was its heart. And you feel it when someone puts a knife to your heart. The response was not tactical, it was desperate. Every breath unit in the tunnel system converged on the core, and the Nexus itself did something it had never done before, something the Conquered's intelligence had theorized about but never confirmed. It screamed, not sound. Frequency, a psychic pulse that broadcast the collective pain of every breath soldier dying on the surface. Thousands of deaths experienced simultaneously, pushed outward like a wave. It had been used 3 times before in the war against the Riyathi. It caused immediate retreat. Against the Torvani, it caused a complete psychological collapse that lasted 6 hours. Against the Plessy, it caused casualties from the shock alone. Nate's team felt it hit. It was grief. Not their grief, the breath's grief, raw and enormous and alien, the pain of a species feeling itself die one soldier at a time. It slammed into them with a weight that had nothing to do with physics. Sam went to his knees. Kit dropped a detonator. A soldier named Grace Park pressed her hands to her temples and made a sound that was not a word. Nate staggered, caught himself on the wall. The grief poured through him, and for a moment he was nowhere, not on the moon, not in the tunnel, just drowning in a sadness so large it had no edges. But Nate Harlow had carried grief before, not collective, not shared, the private. Humankind, the kind you carry alone in the dark with no hive mind to distribute. The weight. He had buried friends. He had written letters to families. He had held the memory of every person he'd lost in a place behind his ribs that never stopped aching, and he had gotten up every morning anyway and done the work. The breath grief was enormous, but it was shared. Human grief was smaller, but you carried it alone, and that it turned out made you stronger. Nate stood up. His team stood up. Grace wiped her face, picked up her weapon. Sam got off his knees. Kit found the detonator. Blow it, Nate said. Kit blew it. Nexus came apart in a pillar of white Fire that rose through the moon's crust and was visible from orbit, a single, bright wound in the dead gray surface. On Carrara's tactical display, the red markers, breath units across 4 systems went still, then scattered, then broke. The breath invasion collapsed. Not slowly, not in stages, it collapsed. The way a building collapses when you remove the single beam holding everything up, all at once, all together. With a sound you felt more than heard. Nate's team didn't make it out clean. The tunnel system was collapsing, and the breath in the corridors were dying. But still dangerous, disconnected from the hive, fighting on reflex, on animal instinct. Nate put himself at the rear of his team and held the corridor while they moved toward extraction. He held it the way he'd held everything in his life. With his body, with his stubbornness, with the quiet understanding that some doors only stay shut if someone stands in front of them. Kit was the last one to hear his voice on the comms. Keep moving, don't stop. She didn't stop. None of them did. The shuttle lifted off. With 5 of the 6 months later, a memorial was held on Pale Reach, the same station where Mag Dunn had placed a deployment order on a table and smiled. Her cold Boston smile. The chamber was full, 1,000 species, more watching. On feeds across the galaxy, Cole stood in the back, arms folded, face unreadable. Lucy sat with Eli, who was pointing at the architecture and whispering about load-bearing materials. Kara watched from a screen on the Blackjack run, already working on something classified that she wouldn't talk about. Pete Calloway sat in the 4th row with his hands clasped and Nate's dog tags around his neck, resting against his chest beside the photo of Biscuit. Varric was invited to speak. He had not wanted to. He was Riafi. His species expressed important things through silence, through the weight of words withheld, but the conquered council asked, and he understood that some silences need to be broken to mean anything. He stood before the assembly, tall, silver-skinned, changed in ways that didn't show on the surface but had rearranged everything underneath. He said one thing: they told us humans were fragile. They were right. Fragile things fight the hardest because they know what it costs to break. He stepped down. Chamber was quiet, not the dismissive quiet of that first council meeting when Mag Dunn offered 4,000 soldiers and the room treated it like a child's drawing. This quiet was the kind that happens when a room full of people hear something true and need a moment to let it settle into their bones. Somewhere in the Concord archives, a clerk updated a file under the species entry for Homo sapiens. The classification line changed. Provisional member was deleted. Full strategic partner was entered. Below the official entry, someone added an annotation in small text. It was unofficial. It was not formatted correctly. It violated 6 Concord documentation standards. Nobody removed it. It read, "Do not underestimate," on the memorial wall, among the names of the dead from every species that had fought and bled and held the line. Nate Harlow's name sat in a row of human names that were ordinary and short and looked no different from any other names. On the wall, there was nothing next to them that explained what they had done. No footnotes, no context, just names carved in stone in a station that floated in the dark between stars. Pete touched the dog tags at his chest. Eli finally stopped talking. Lucy looked at the wall and said nothing, because some things don't fit in words and they silence says them.